Can you summarise what the end of the century is like compared to someone living at the beginning of the century?
It's very, very hard to answer, but it is a really important question. It's a great question. So there's a lot more engagement in politics and the state by ordinary people by the end of the 17th century. Religion has changed significantly, and in particular, there's a really significant element of religious diversity which has been added.
Hello everyone, welcome to the British History Channel with me, Philippa Lacey Brewell, and to our latest historian interview. If you've been here before, thank you for coming back, and if this is your first time, then thank you for checking out the channel. If you love British history, you are in the right place. Not only have I got a great interview for you today, but there are over 40 other historian interviews available on the British History Channel, along with other history videos, and you can also join me live every other Monday for British History Live. Now, today I am talking to Dr. Jonathan Healey. Jonathan is a social historian of early modern England and directs the MSc in English Local History and the undergraduate diploma in social and local history at the University of Oxford. His new book, this one, The Blazing World, A New History of Revolutionary England, was published in April 2024, and it takes readers into the raw politics, the religious divisions, civil wars, of course, plague, witch trials, as well as discussing things such as press freedom and other things. There are so many strange but fascinating facts about this century and many parallels to today, and we're going to be exploring many of those with Jonathan today. Jonathan, welcome to the British History Channel. Before we get started, can you just introduce yourself a bit, please? Tell us who you are and how you got into history.
Oh, no, that's a great question. So I'm a historian of the 17th century, or the early modern period. I work at the University of Oxford, or I work at the Department for Continuing Education. So we do adult education stuff. It's great, wonderful students. I got into history through having a really good history teacher who was very, very old school. I actually had a run of really, really good history teachers, but there was one in particular who was extremely old school, and I remember him showing us slides of sort of, altar rails and things like that, and for some reason, which is a bit weird, as a teenager in the 90s, I was transfixed by these, old slides. I kind of, I studied at university and found that I really enjoyed the opportunity to kind of contribute ideas to sort of human knowledge. And of course, as a historian, you then go and do postgraduate study, and you get ever more obscure and ever more specific with your research. And I ended up working on 17th century poor law, which is wonderful and fascinating. But I also felt that there was a sort of bigger story to tell about the 17th century for the sort of wider reading public. It's a century which is sort of passed over quite often. I mean, professional historians know all about it, but in the public eye, it's not quite as well known about. And so I felt that there was a sort of, there was a space for a big narrative. I'm quite a fan of narrative history, despite years as a quantitative historian. I do love a nice story.
It's told very, very well in your book.
Thank you.
And the more, obviously, even if someone's brand new to the 17th century, they're going to read your book and be like, "Oh my God, it is, it is packed. This is packed." Now, that must have been a challenge, though, to try and get one whole century, especially one as full, as it turns out, as the 17th century, into one book. How challenging was that?
Incredibly challenging. It was it drove me slightly mad. One thing I did was I snipped off some years. So I started in 1603 and finished in sort of 1689. So that's 40 out of the way, just like that. But in order, I also made it much more difficult for myself, because one of the frustrations I sometimes have with popular history writing is that it is very top down. It's almost always, when you sort of see these kind of, big narratives, it's almost always very much focused on the politics, and there's a lot of politics in the Blazing World. There's a lot of top-down stuff, but I also wanted to tell that kind of broader story, that richer story, which brings in ordinary people and the lives that they led, and the big changes that which were going on in the 17th century to their lives. And I wanted to bring that in as well. So not only did I give myself this challenge of writing about a whole century and a whole kind of, really sort of incredibly complicated, lots of isms and different forms of church practice, which are all very important and whatever and very hard to explain. Not only did I do that, but I also tried to bring in things like the economic history, demography, cultural history, the history of sport, the history of ideas, all that kind of stuff. So yeah, I made it very, very difficult, and ultimately you kind of have to, doing that, you have to really kind of be disciplined. You can't use every single example that you want to because there's so many more. I mean, I got told that there's probably a few too many examples of people sort of farting in church and all that kind of stuff, and maybe I'll have one person farting in church for the whole book, but you have to be quite disciplined with that. But also, I think it is important to try and kind of keep a broad story, and my broad story was this sort of pressure building up into the civil wars in the middle of the century, and then a sort of almost like a kind of release in the later 17th century when the economic context has changed drastically, but also things like running themes throughout the book, things like rising literacy, things like the role of the middling sort of people, which I make quite a lot about. Things like about sort of constitutional conflicts, different debates over different things, and again, one of my themes throughout the book is that the country, I'm focusing on England here. I mean, that was another hard decision that I focus on one of these kind of really each very individually important constituent parts of the British Isles or the Atlantic archipelago. So I focused on England, which is, of course, one decision. But one of the things that I kind of really emphasize is that because of the complexity of this society, because of the richness of this society, in many, many ways, it's very, very difficult to govern, which means that if you happen to be king, it's a bloody hard job, and that sort of becomes that is one of the sort of themes. So it's partly about having that overarching story, but it's also partly about having themes and recurring ideas and all that kind of stuff.
I love the fact that obviously you were covering what was happening in politics, but you were definitely getting in there how that was affecting, quote unquote, the ordinary folk. I don't know, like saying the ordinary people. But equally, what stuff was going on that was not really much to do with politics, but was still happening to everybody as well at the same time, and some of that sort of fed upwards. So I'd love to get into quite a few of these themes today with you. The first thing that I remember, there's quite a few that also I thought, if I didn't know this was a book, if I literally just took this bit, whatever it was, and didn't tell somebody that this was about the 17th century, this could be about today. And the first one was about, I remember it because I was actually listening to the book when I first read through it, and then I've read through it. But it really struck me about population. I think there'd been a period of population growth towards the end of Elizabeth's reign. So as we go into the 17th century, that it makes jobs less easy to come by, pushes wages down. So therefore, the impact of that is that young people can't find a job as easily, can't afford housing. Therefore, they're getting married later if they're getting married at all. Therefore, there's less children being born. And that bit, I was like, blimey, but that could be now. And then you go in to talk about then that there's like a cycle. Then you've got people who can't get married, less children. So then you've got less people eventually, and then and it just goes on like this. And that's the sort of thing I was thinking. Well, has that got anything to do really with the people in charge, or is this the cycle that goes round regardless of that? And yet, they might come in and try and pretend they've got some control over it, or the population think they've got some control over it or something. I don't know. But were those changes anything to do with what was happening top level, or was this just natural? I don't know.
So, I mean, I think a lot of the driving force behind those changes is kind of natural and cyclical, and it's one of the. I mean, going right back to the basics, I think one of the great
Mm,
things about this period is that we can talk about this kind of thing, uh,
mm,
because we know so much about it, and the fact that we can have a stab at working out what the population is across the whole century, you know, with relatively good precise numbers is incredible. You know, it's amazing, detailed, um, diligent, painstaking research has gone into this,
mm,
and it's based on things like, you know, so for example, if you do your family tree, once you get back to this period, you're in the parish register era. So you're looking at registers of births, marriages, or baptisms, marriages, and burials in parishes, and you're using those to reconstruct your family tree. But what historians have done with that is they've counted the number of baptisms and they've counted the number of marriages, and sometimes they've linked them together to sort of work out what age people were getting married, and it's incredibly clever,
mm,
and it allows these kind of theories about how demographic change is taking place and how it's self-regulating, to be developed. So that's the first thing. It's just incredible that we have this detailed information about this society 400 years ago. I mean, that's
mm,
amazing. Um, the uh, the question you asked about what's the relationship between all this stuff and those in charge? Well, those in charge do try and do something about it. So particularly interestingly enough, they're sort of more worried about population stagnation or the population falling than they are about population growth. So in the later 17th century, they worry that there's not enough people being born. So they do things like, they try and encourage people to get married, because this is a time when the vast majority of children are born within wedlock. So it's kind of seen as being very, very important. Whether that actually has any impact is it's very, very hard to say, and it
mm,
probably didn't, to be quite honest. There's probably not a huge amount that the government can do about demography then, or even now, really.
mm,
They do things to kind of mitigate the impacts of population growth. So one of the really, really important things they do is they create this system of poor relief, where every parish across the country has a little tax and gives money to the poor. And it's the first national system of poor relief anywhere in the world, or for tax-funded poor relief anywhere in the world. It's an amazing achievement for the
mm,
state, if you like. And that's partly because of, they need to do that partly because of population growth. But the other thing is that the growth in population in the early 17th century, and this is something that I tried to sort of get across in the book. I don't know how successful I was, but the impact, or among the impacts, are things like inflation, as you mentioned,
mm,
and inflation causes lots and lots of problems for the state because it erodes the tax revenues of the state. And a lot of the problems that, say, James the First has, in the early 17th century, a lot of those problems came down to not having enough money, and so therefore it is fundamentally related to this inflation. But it also tied in to this idea that I ran with quite a bit in the book about the rise of the middle sort of people,
mm,
because what happened is that when prices were going up, it meant that the price of food was going up. So if you're a farmer and you've got a reasonable amount of land and you've got enough to feed your family, and then you can sell a bit of the food that you grow on, then you do very, very well out of rising prices. You can also sublet your land, so you can become a sort of a sort of petty landlord, and that can make you a bit of money. And so these people did very, very well. They made a lot of money. They rebuilt their houses. A lot of the surviving kind of cottages that we see today in the English countryside are houses which were built by these middling farmers, sort of yeomen, these kind of people. And so they made money. They spent it on their houses, and nice new curtains, carpets, clothes, and stuff, and books as well. And they also so they read books. They read books about the weather, they read books about, household management, and they read books about religion, and they read books about the state. And there's lots of different things you can read about. But then also they increasingly send their children off to the universities or to London to join, the Inns of Court, for example, or have apprenticeships. So people like John Lilburn, for example, the famous leveller, he grew up in a sort of middling kind of background, a lower gentry background in the northeast, in near Newcastle. And he was sent as an apprentice as a youngster to London. And when he went to London, he became involved in these sort of radical print networks, initially about religion, but then eventually he becomes a kind of big spokesman for the Levellers, who are arguing for a widening of the franchise. And there's a sort of, not every middling sort son ends up in sort of radical revolutionary groups. In fact, lots of them do the opposite. But it's more that they are engaged in this political discussion in whatever way they end up being engaged in it. So there's that. And also the other thing is, which I think is really, really important, and I kind of talk about it briefly in the book. I probably wasn't allowed by my editors to go off on one about it, is that if you are part of this sort of increasingly commercial society, you're quite wealthy, you're quite well read, you've got more economic interests, the one thing that you're absolutely going to have to get yourself involved in is the law. And it is England in 1600 was an incredibly litigious society. There's this historian at Cambridge called Craig Muldrew who did this wonderfully detailed work where he calculated that on average an English household would be involved in one lawsuit per year. So it's majorly litigious. And in order to do that, they have to kind of learn some of the ins and outs of the law, and that encourages them to think about the Constitution. It encourages them to think about the state. So I think there's all these kind of almost like sort of cascades which come off this population, which then help create an increasingly politicized population.
That's fascinating. So they're getting more means to get educated, have their own ideas. Goodness me! And then they're they're implementing them. They're thinking through what's happening and taking each other to court on a regular basis.
And it's not just men either. I mean, in terms of formal education, very much dominated by men. In terms of, if you go into the law, if you go to the universities, you have to be a man.
Right.
But women would be involved in initiating lawsuits, for example. Women would read. Female literacy is higher than we think it was in this period, and in the middle of the 17th century, women have this kind of sort of efflorescence, if you like, of free thinking ideas, particularly in London, where lots of women join radical religious groups. So it's not, it's kind of, I mean, it is. You mostly see it with the men because they leave more records, but it's not restricted to men, it's women as well. It's kind of very broadening of the debate, if you like.
Because the religions, you talk about that quite a lot, and it's obviously because they're rising, and it's quite a thing to keep track of all the different approaches that there are. You talk, because just thinking there, where you're saying about women, was it the Quakers? Who is it that allowed women preachers? The Quakers.
The Quakers,
so that was becoming popular as well. And so, I wanted to ask you about propaganda, and because I presume we, probably say propaganda in some way, shape, or form has been, there since time immemorial, because someone's always trying to persuade someone else that their cause is better than the other. But it's this. Am I right in thinking it's the 17th century where propaganda is produced for the masses as such, as opposed to just sort of an elite that you're trying to get on side?
Yeah, it's a complicated question, because that you go back to the Romans and they have circuses and there's an element of propaganda there, and every time you look at a building, you look at a medieval castle, then that's you're sort of yokel looking up at a medieval castle. There's an element of propaganda about that, and that sort of traditionalist kind of performance propaganda it continues into the 17th century, and you see things like pageants, street processions, coronations, all those kind of things. Every time a royal proclamation is made, a guy will stand in the town and they'll blow a trumpet or ring a bell and shout, "Oh yay, oh yay, oh yay," and they give out this kind of performance, and that's all propaganda. What I think you get in the 17th century, which is new, is there's a lot more printed, written propaganda. And it's, propaganda, obviously, we come at this from a slightly 20th century perspective where, every GCSE student studies kind of, 20th century propaganda. And there is stuff which is propaganda in the sort of modern sense, but it's more subtle than that often. And in fact, 17th century people had quite a sophisticated grasp of spin, if you like, for want of a better term. And they're also in a period when literacy is getting higher. There's the proportion of people who can read is much higher. There's an increasing concentration of literate people in and around London. And that's very, very important because that's the political centre as well. That's where the politics is happening. If you want to have a riot, you want to get a crowd protest, it matters much. It's going to have much more impact if you do it in Westminster than if you do it in the Lake District, for example. Although I start off the book with a protest in the Lake District, so there's that, but also the availability of print shops, paper, ink, all those kind of things is greater. So people can use, and it's not just the government, it's opposition groups, it's religious groups, it's the church. Everyone who can is putting things down on paper and using print. And so I think it's that's new rather than propaganda as such. But it is, you look at the amount of printed material, and it's not all what we would call propaganda, but it is, a lot of it is what we might call spin, I suppose. And you look at, there's a graph that historians have constructed for the number of surviving titles across the 17th century, and it goes and it suddenly jumps in 1641-42, and it goes down a bit again, and then the regicide happens, it jumps again, and then it goes down again, and then the restoration happens, it jumps again, and it's all gradually getting higher and higher. And then the exclusion crisis in the 1680s, when they're arguing over whether James II should be allowed to come to the throne, it goes up again. There's a huge kind of huge spike in print, and then it's sort of and it's growing and growing over the century, and it just means that sort of what we probably used to call the public sphere, I think we still can call it the public sphere. I'm a bit old-fashioned like that, but that is growing. It's becoming more sophisticated. At the same time, it's not, I say sophisticated, there's an awful lot of complete nonsense which is published, and it's interesting nonsense because it tells us something about that culture. But there's a lot of stuff which is about the supernatural, for example. I make the point at the end of the book that one of the sort of political tracts that comes out in the 1690s is about a massive fish that gets hauled out of the sea at Whitehall in the Royal Palace, and everyone's sort of saying, well, what does this fish mean? What's it mean they've pulled out this huge whopping great fish from the Thames? And it's not like they're all sitting there saying, oh, have you read the latest tract from John Locke? Half the time they're saying, well, there's some funny lights in the sky, what does that mean? So it's a very, very complicated, multivocal world. But yeah, it's brilliant. It's also fascinating.
I suppose it's a reminder that humans have always been human, and actually, our attention is taken by, mundane, inane nonsense now, isn't it?
Yeah, there's a lot of things like cookery books, or which they're not nonsense. They're really useful. And there's a huge there's a market for books about family relations. There's a great one by this Puritan minister called William Gouge, who's a Londoner, and he attracts these huge crowds to his sermons. And he wrote a book called Of Domestical Duties, and it's all about how husbands and wives should should live their lives and how they should manage their household and look after their children, all that kind of stuff. And you can imagine that having a market now. I mean, okay, yeah. Maybe some of his approaches to parenting might not be quite so.
He might have some good tips. He might have some good tips that we've lost.
There is quite a good bit where he's relatively balanced in terms. I say relatively balanced in terms of relations between husbands and wives, but he does basically say that wives should, broadly speaking, be obedient to their husband. But he says that when he gave this as a sermon in London, in one of these big sort of public sermons, there were a load of women at the back who were kind of heckling him because they didn't agree. So it's again,
was that more of a wish than a sort
of... I think so. I think so. But it's very, very interesting.
It is interesting. So do we see the rise of the newspaper, more what we would recognise as that kind of distribution of information?
Yeah, although information might be a bit...
Or ideas, words, random thoughts.
Yeah, sort of, babble. So in the 1620s, you get periodical newspapers, but they are specifically banned from talking about English news. So they dealt with the continental news. And there's a great bit where basically the first ever English newspaper that survives basically says... sorry, there's no news because they haven't got anything yet.
Got nothing to say.
Yeah. But then in it actually has a precise date on the 22nd of November, 1640. Sorry, no, the 29th of November, 1641. The first English periodical newspaper comes out. It covers a week's worth of news. So it starts on the 22nd of November, but it came out on the 29th. And they then became a really central part of the information networks during the Civil War. And what basically happened is, although quite a lot of them said, this is an impartial newspaper, most of them had a fairly strong steer one way or the other. Most of them were published in London.
Right, okay.
So they were mostly parliamentarian, but there was a royalist... There were royalist ones, there's one published in Oxford, which is quite a funny one. They're all quite funny as well. I mean, they just, spend half the time telling news and half the time just taking the piss out of each other, particularly if they ever get arrested. One of the parliamentarian journalists managed to get arrested because he was too radical, so the House of Lords threw him in jail. And then his rival over in Oxford, which is the royalist capital, was saying, Britannicus is in jail this week. Where's his paper gone? Kind of thing. So they are great fun, and they do sort of settle down a bit into the later 17th century, and fairly quickly when the Republic comes in, the Republic recognizes two things. One is that newspapers are here to stay, but secondly, they probably should regulate them a bit because they're going to get some criticism. So they have an official one which is quite popular, but they kind of basically stamp out all the other ones. And then again in the later 17th century, you start to get, with the emergence of political parties, you get the Whigs and the Tories. They have their own newspapers, and the Tory newspapers are kind of led by this guy called Roger Lestrange, who's another of the 17th century's great contributions to our society, which is unscrupulous journalists. There's a guy called Marchmont Needham who's brilliantly unscrupulous, and then there's this guy Roger Lestrange, who his enemies call him Crackfart. Because, well, it's just funny, isn't it? And he writes these kind of really scurrilous, quite sort of, bumptious Tory newspaper things. And again, they're very, very funny, and they're very bizarre. But it's not, you're not looking at a world of The Economist or The Times of London. It's very much we're very much in Daily Star territory. Although I did see something about Daily Star actually having more science coverage than any other newspaper, so I probably shouldn't be reading about Daily Star. But yeah, it's a kind
propaganda on the part of the other ones.
Yeah, it's it's a cacophonous world.
Which is finding their feet. There's no rules. Yeah. No one's done this before.
No. And you're right. There's no, there's censorship, and it's increasingly hard to It's increasingly hard to actually make it work. And by the end of the 17th century, it's almost entirely gone.
Mm.
So, you know, and even in the 1630s, when there's a relatively strict censorship regime, all you need to do is go over to the Netherlands, publish there, and then smuggle it in, and it's quite easy to do that. Uh, so, so yeah, it's as I say, difficult to govern.
Yeah, but and also where there's a will, there's a way, as always.
Indeed, yes.
So, um, another thing that I found very interesting was that once the Civil War was settled down and we've got the Restoration, I presume because there's a bit more stability, you see increase in trade and just sort of general prosperity. Um, just as a side note, more rivers, which I found was very interesting because I knew the Romans had sort of carved out extra rivers, but I didn't realise that the Stuarts also 17th century that also
Yeah,
happened.
so navigable rivers. So they're not, I mean, they're not
Mm,
creating new rivers, but they're sort of digging them out so you can get boats down them. But yeah, I mean,
right, right.
it's sort of like a kind of, we all know about the canals of the
Mm,
Industrial Revolution, don't we? But yeah, I mean, there's a huge kind of mileage of navigable rivers are added in the late 17th and early 18th century.
yeah.
Uh, and one of the reasons that England and Britain is very, very prosperous at this point is that it's quite easy to move stuff around. You kind of compare it to France, which is huge, but there's a lot of places in France which are quite a long way from the sea, whereas in England you're never that far away from the sea. And at this point in time, if you want to move anything heavy, you have to do it by water because there isn't the capacity to do it over land. So the country has a lot of natural advantages.
Mm,
And those seem to be kind of coming into their own in the later 17th century. And I think it's partly to do with stability. It's partly to do with the fact that the population has stopped growing. So as people get wealthier, they actually get more money in their pockets. So living standards seem to increase. So if you're a labourer, for example, your real income is twice as high in 1700 as it would have been in 1600, and that makes a huge difference. Uh,
mm,
Things like famine, you don't have famines anymore. The last famine in England in 1623. The plague has disappeared after the 1660s.
mm,
There's also a growth of international trade, and that includes colonial trade, for example. So things like the East India Company, the Royal African Company are making a lot of money, in the latter case out of slavery. So
mm.
there's kind of colonial wealth which is starting to come in as well by the late 17th century. I think I've always been most sort of convinced by the arguments of people like the late Sir Tony Wrigley, who's one of the great economic historians, who basically argues that by the late 17th century in England, the country is sort of all fitting together really, really well, and it's become a really efficient kind of market
Right.
that has made the country more prosperous. Um, and
So we've
you,
got the logistics, we've got a bit more money in our
yeah,
pockets.
yeah, exactly. And people have if you look at one way to look at it is to look at um, places like the Lake District, for example, where you've got a very kind of rough land, which is not particularly suitable for growing grain. But in 1600, all these little valleys in the mountains are all growing grain because they have to. But by 1700, they've stopped. And all they're doing is they're growing is they've got sheep and cattle basically
Mhm.
and meadows and all that kind of stuff. It's all grassland farming. They've given up on growing barley and oats and all that kind of stuff because they don't need to anymore because they're confident that they can buy it in from elsewhere. And that means that the whole country can become more efficient because everywhere specializes in what their land is good at.
Mm.
So that I think is one of the really interesting insights of those economic historians which is where I started my career really with those guys. And yeah, it's
And we and we see as a consequence of that arising well, all our vices. Well, maybe not all of them, but coffee, sugar, tobacco,
yeah, oh,
this
absolutely, yeah,
consumption culture
yeah,
that that grows up.
yeah, yeah, yeah. It's said that by the 1690s, I think it said that every sort of peasant in the field is it gets through a kind of a whole bunch of tobacco every year. So and people knew it was unhealthy as well. I mean, James the First very famously was sort of thought, oh, this all looks terrible. I'm not sure why we're all smoking this, but people did. So yeah, and coffee is huge by the late 17th century. And again, I mean, it used to be the case that historians would say, okay, coffee came in and everyone sits around in their coffee shops
Yeah.
discussing politics.
Everyone got political. It's coffee's
Yeah,
fault.
exactly. And I'm glad we sort of moved away from that. Nonetheless, there is, I think, an element of truth there. Interestingly enough, tea, which of course becomes this sort of great English thing later on, is hardly ever used. Although there's a few references to it. We're very much a coffee country in the late 17th century.
I knew it.
Yeah, well, no, I mean, I'm more of a coffee guy myself, so I can kind of. And
Well, I
chocolate
move.
as
It depends
well.
what time of the day, but yeah.
Yeah, the thing about chocolate, though, one thing I found really fascinating is that it would have tasted really, really bitter.
Mm,
We think of hot chocolate of a nice a nice sort of sweet cup of nice sweet chocolate, but at the time it would have been close to coffee, I think. And so they would fill it with sugar, and then that again kind of fed into the demand for sugar.
mm,
So yeah, and it's not just coffee and tea and chocolate, but also by 1700 there's a lot more of a market for example, Asian textiles. So Indian cotton is being brought over by the East India Company, which is suddenly making loads of money. Um, and
mm,
they make money out of clothes rather than spices because they weren't able to. They got kind of forced out by the Dutch, and so it becomes a much more sort of globalized economy, particularly in London, but everywhere to a point. And it's very interesting. And one of the bits that I loved writing about and I found really fascinating is the people who are writing about this and the attitudes that they have. So there's a guy called Nicholas Barban, who is the son of a famous Puritan called Praise God Barebone. And I think when he was christened, he was given one of these ridiculous Puritan names, like, if Jesus Christ hadn't died for thee, then you would be damned, Barban. But he changed his name to Nicholas, understandably.
mm,
And when he grew up, he was sort of surrounded. He was in London. He was a really snappy dresser as well. And he tried to sort of rationalize this, and he basically kind of came up with these ideas that essentially, if you have all these consumer goods, then people want to buy them. So they work harder. And that means that everyone gets wealthier because everyone's working harder. And it's sort of like, it's kind of like the justifications for capitalism that you get in the 20th century. Greed is good, basically.
mm,
And it's really interesting that they're sort of coming, and very controversial at the time because most people thought greed was a sin.
mm,
So yeah, but because of this kind of wealth, they're starting to kind of rethink and come up with these very modern ideas, for
mm.
better or worse.
I think you called it consumption culture, and it is
Yeah,
the
I
beginning of
probably
that
did,
sort
yeah.
of. um, okay, so things are going quite well here for people living here, but I mean, at some point in the 17th century, we've started to get emigration away.
Yeah.
Is that purely like what were the driving forces behind that? I know there was a religious element, but is that the
Yeah.
sole element or
No, definitely not.
no?
I mean, it is an element, but I think historians would probably say that the majority of people who emigrate to the Americas are doing it for sort of economic reasons, really. In that, particularly in the sort of 1630s,
Hmm.
there's a lot of poverty in England. There's a lot of land hunger, and
And we've just
it,
had a famine, did you say 28?
yeah,
Yeah,
1623 is a
23,
famine in the
sorry.
north of England. Yeah, so there's a lot of people kind of look at it and think, well, do you know what? Look, there's all this space because they sort of saw it as being empty, even though it wasn't.
Mm,
Um, there's all this kind of space for me to set up a farm and then I can have sort of have my own land, all this kind of stuff. So it's very attractive to people who are kind of, not especially wealthy. And the other thing is there's attempts by the state to kind of sweep up vagrants out of London and move them over to the Americas. At the same time, there is a religious element. I don't think we should write that out, particularly in the 1630s when there's quite a repressive religious culture associated with William Laud, Archbishop of Canterbury, where if you're basically a bit of a Puritan, then you're kind of out in the cold a little bit. So a lot of them move over. I say a lot, a reasonable number of them move over to sort of Massachusetts and New England, basically to kind of create their own godly communities. Then, of course, a lot of them come back though. That's
what I was going to ask. Is it a flow one way, or when things get a bit better, do people start?
So, for example, there's one of the most notorious Puritan firebrands is a guy called Hugh Peters, who he wasn't a regicide. So he didn't sign the king's death warrant, but he did get executed just because they hated him so much in 1660. And he was a bit of a bastard, to be honest.
He annoyed the wrong people, clearly.
Yeah, I mean, he was a sort of fairly nasty piece of work in lots of one of these kind of proper sort of firebrand nutball preachers. And he went over to Massachusetts. I think it was Massachusetts. Oh, New England anyway. And then he came back. And another one who I think has a slightly rawer deal is a guy called Henry Vane the Younger, who's the son of one of the secretaries of state. He went over to New England. He was very, very successful, and then the Civil War happened, and he came back, and he ended up as being this kind of major political figure in the 1650s, cordially hated by Oliver Cromwell and Charles II. Although it's Charles II who has him executed in 1662, I think it is. Again, I think he has a bit of a raw deal, but again, he's one of these people who goes over to the Americas because he wants to get away from the sort of restrictive Laudian church, but then comes back as soon as he gets the opportunity. And yeah, quite a few people do that.
Well, I imagine it's not easy. It wouldn't have been easy. You don't get over there and just
no. It's a long journey as well. I get frustrated with a sort of 45-minute commute. So
I always figure it must have been they either have to be incredibly adventurous or incredibly annoyed or frustrated or whatever to endeavour to do that journey for a start, and then to set up somewhere they've never been, never seen.
Oh no, it's incredible, really. I mean, the sort of the barriers to doing that are huge. But yeah.
Fascinating. So one more, I've got a couple more questions before we'll sort of wrap up the main part of the interview. But so we talked a little bit about religion there. Now, we'll talk a little, we've talked mainly about what happens to the ordinary folk. I really need to find a new phrase for that. But of course, it would be remiss of me not to mention that we start off with an absolute monarchy at the beginning of the century. And by the end of the century, we're looking at parliaments asking, in the Glorious Revolution, inviting the monarch to come. And so we see a big shift in that.
Yeah.
Again, what was the role of religion in that? Or is that a red herring? What were the factors?
It's a really good question. So you get essentially, so the way I see it, these are very, very complicated questions of different views on, for example, the degree to which James I is an absolute monarch. He believed in the divine right of kings, but did that mean that he was above the law? He would say no. But then at the same time, some of the ways that him and his son acted suggested that they felt that they were ultimately above the law and therefore absolute. But so, as I say, these are very, very complicated questions. I do think that there is a big, big shift in these kind of constitutional terms across the 17th century, from a situation where England could go down this kind of continental approach to government, where the king is incredibly powerful, has absolute power. But whether or not, and I mean, I think probably he did, whether or not you agree that Charles I wants to go down that route, he's stopped. And when his son comes in at the Restoration, he doesn't really try and kind of push a similar kind of line. He does a little bit, but not as much. And anyway, it all kind of comes apart with his brother James II, who tries to kind of again sort of create this sort of absolutist state backed by an army, but then is essentially kind of thrown out. And you get the situation by the end of the 17th century where the effectively what's happened is that Parliament has chosen the monarch, and there's no getting away from the fact that that shows that there's a big shift in the relative power between Parliament and monarchy, and it's by the 18th century, it's basically Parliament which is choosing the government, and that's what's really, really important. All tax comes from Parliament by the end of the 17th century. So there's big changes. They're quite subtle. They're quite hard to get your head around. They are debated in lots and lots of ways, but they seem to me to be quite significant. And religion is like a kind of constant part of this. Because essentially a lot of the people who are opposing the kind of absolutist tendencies of the monarchy are either Puritans or sympathetic to dissenters. And I'm not quite sure what that means in a way, because what would have happened if Charles I had been a Puritan. And I mean, he hated Puritans, but let's say he was a Puritan, and all those Puritans in Parliament, they thought, oh, this guy's great, and he then has these kind of absolutist tendencies. Do they look at it and go, okay, well, that's fine, he's one of us, that's fine, we get it, we're fine with that, and I'm not sure they do, because I think there's another kind of big set of debates running through the period, which is about the relationship between the monarchy and the law. And I think that's kind of partly independent of religion. On the other hand, there's almost a sort of cultural dissonance between two views of what society is like. And the way, say, Charles I thinks of society is he thinks of it as very, very kind of hierarchical, very, very sort of top down. Essentially, power comes from above, and everything should be in its place. And that's how he understands art. It's how he understands politics. It's how he understands religion. It's very well thought out. It's a very kind of cogent, quite a cogent way of thinking. But it's very different to the way that a lot of Puritans think, which is that the power comes from below, if you like, and everyone should have a kind of everyone should have an input into religion and faith, and that then is sort of transposed over to politics. One of the most kind of symbolic ways that this is expressed is this big debate about where you put the communion table in the church. Center of the church, so it's surrounded by the people, even though it can get a bit mucky, or do you rail it off and put it at the at like an altar? And the sort of the Charles I view is you rail it off and you put it like an altar, because that's that maintains decorum. This is God's table. You don't want it to be used for changing nappies or anything like that. But the different way of thinking about it is, but if you do that, it moves it away from the community. And again, I think there's these two sort of ways of thinking in the 17th century, this sort of top-down, bottom-up way of thinking. And they are partly influenced by religion, but they're also partly influenced by ideas about the law and about the constitution. So yeah, I mean,
it's a mix.
It's a real mix. But it's why, and I honestly don't think these debates are settled. And I think one of the great things about this century, as probably with all centuries, if you like, is that there's so much that future historians can do, and you'll get future historians who come in and say, this is a load of nonsense, what's all this rubbish, and come up with great ideas, and that debate will continue, I think, and that again makes it really vibrant and interesting as a period.
And is that fueled by just how much documentation is available? Because
There's so much.
I was going to say, surely it's not possible for one person to have ever
No,
got through it
nowhere
all.
near. No, 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 no.
Mm,
No, I mean, like, what I'm working on at the moment, I'm doing about, sort of day-to-day business in Parliament. And, you've got four different parliamentary diaries, all which say something slightly different. And then you've got the official record, and then you've got newspapers, and, it's just so much.
mm,
Yeah.
fascinating. And that's the next book, is it?
If I don't go mad. Uh,
Okay, well, I'm going to ask you. Uh, you're going to hate me. Okay, so because my final question before I've got a couple of general ones I want to ask you, but okay, so for again the ordinary person, but what can you summarize what the end of the century is like compared to someone living at the beginning of the century? What would you think would be the main differences?
So I'm not going to hate you because I think that's a brilliant question, and I
Oh, good.
always had this in mind when I was reading the book, when I was writing the book, and it's hard, it's very very hard to answer, but it is a really important question. It's a great question. I think in politics, I'll start with politics. There's more involvement of ordinary people in politics, and it's not just through elections or through parliament. It's through reading, it's through discussing, it's even through things like being involved in running the poor law, for example. If you're a yeoman farmer, you might be the overseer of the poor one year, and that means you have to make a decision about who gets poor relief, and that's really political and very very hard. So there's a lot more engagement in politics and the state by ordinary people by the end of the 17th century. Religion has changed significantly, and in particular, there's a really significant element of religious diversity which has been added. At the start of the 17th century, broadly, everyone's a Protestant. There's a few Catholics, and they're looked upon as being a bit dangerous. But broadly speaking, everyone is a kind of conformist Protestant. By 1700, that's not the case. You've still got the Catholics, about the same proportion of the population, but within Protestantism, there's been the faith has been shattered, and you've got all these kind of dissenting groups, and they are accepted, broadly speaking, that they are going to be a permanent part of the landscape. They're not massive in terms of numbers. We're talking 5 to 10, maybe 15% of the population, but they are significant, and everyone would know that there are Quakers or Baptists in their village or in the next village, and that is a really really important. That's an important cultural change, but also in economic terms, there's the country is wealthier. Even the poorest people are. They have more access to food. They have healthier. Probably have healthier diets. Their income is probably twice as high as it was in 1600. But amongst wealthier people, there's a more kind of globalized consumer culture. So there's been a lot of change. There's been a lot of change, and the subtitle of the book, A History of Revolutionary England, is usually, most people assume that I'm talking about the Civil War and the Glorious Revolution and the politics, and I am partly, but it's actually supposed to be. I don't know whether it's got across, but it's supposed to be much broader than that, and it's supposed to reflect the fact that there's been a commercial revolution, there's been a welfare revolution, there's been a revolution in terms of the end of famine and the end of plague, so demographic revolution, and there's all these kind of different underlying changes, which I don't know, maybe I'm stretching it to say that they're revolutionary, but they're certainly very very important, and they certainly have a big impact. So I think there's quite a significant amount of change between 1600 and 1700. Yeah, you have to read the
No,
book.
I think maybe you can tell from the questions I wanted, the elements of your book that I wanted to talk to you about was what was coming across clearly to me, was there's a lot of it's complicated century. You've got a lot of toing and froing and improvements and step backs and everything, but that there is it's significant cultural change over the century that a grandson of somebody who was is living at the end of the century to someone who was their granddad is living at the start, they would have quite significantly different lives.
And there's a lot of roads not taken as well. I mean, absolutism is no longer a factor in 1700. Puritanism isn't really, to be honest.
Mm,
Uh, the Republic has come and gone. I think
mm,
probably if Cromwell had been a bit nicer, then maybe republicanism would have taken hold in England a bit more than it did. But by the end of the 17th century, it's sort of, you are definitely going down a sort of a constitutional monarchist route, but it's definitely a monarchist route. So there's also a lot of, I say, roads not taken, if you like.
mm.
So yeah.
Brilliant. Well, okay, so I've got two more questions for you
Okay.
that are ones that I put to all of my guests. The first one, is there a period of history that you read for pleasure? One outside of what you're known for? Maybe one that you can just read and not have to think you have to
Yeah.
remember
Oh, there's
everything about
loads.
it. Oh, good.
I tell you what, and this is a bit woe is me, but the trouble is when I read about other periods of history, I always end up thinking about the written style of the book. I always get my kind of writer mode on, and I'm like, oh, would I have written this scene like this? But I mean, I like pretty much any kind of history. I'm not a big fan of modern history, to be quite honest. So I
Mm,
read quite a lot of late medieval stuff. Um, I also read quite a lot of books about astrophysics,
okay.
which is not a history subject, but I like the history of science, I suppose, is
Mm,
and particularly sort of more modern history of science. But I mean, 17th century history of science is good as well. But I find myself kind of gravitating to the late Middle Ages, I suppose, quite a bit because it's distant enough,
mm,
and it's
mm.
not Hitler and Stalin.
Yeah.
So yeah.
And okay, and the second question is, what do you think we can learn from history?
Um, so I'm really skeptical about the idea that you look at an event in the past and say, oh, that gives us a roadmap for how we should deal with similar-ish looking events
Mm,
today. Because I think societies are just very, very different.
mm,
What I think is really, really important about history, I mean, so my view about why we should study history is because history is fun and interesting, and I think that's enough. Um,
mm,
but history can also be important, and I think one of the reasons it is that it allows us to step out of our own modern world and look at societies which organize themselves in very, very different ways to the way that we organize our own society. And that comparative element allows us to think more about ourselves. What is it that's unique about modernity, about our own lives? What is it that's different about the way that we organize the world compared to other societies, modern and historical? And I think history does that. And the early modern England, because we know so much about it, it is a really, really good society to study in depth because
mm.
we can look at it and think, well, okay, how have people thought differently to the way that we do today? Because they're intelligent people. I mean, they may have some strange ideas, but they're intelligent people, and they're no less intelligent than we are, really.
So we've got plenty. Historians of the future are going to be looking back at
Yeah,
us and going,
exactly.
oh,
They'll probably think we're nuts. But yeah.
yeah. Okay, fabulous. Well, I've got a few questions for you from my patrons in my Patreon. We're going to talk about the inevitability of the Civil War and
Okay.
things like generational trauma. It's a very
Oh,
interesting
yeah.
question about that in there.
Yeah.
But before we move on to that, for everyone else, please can you tell them where they can find your book, where they can find you online?
So the book should be available in most good bookshops, and you can find me online. I've just joined Instagram, so I'm trying that out.
Very
I'm
good.
mostly on Blue Sky these days, which is very nice. Lots of academics, but yeah, I'm around.
Okay. Fabulous. Okay, well, we'll share your handles, and I'll also share a link to your book, just reminding people who might be listening on the podcast, The Blazing World, A New History of Revolutionary England. So I'll share the links to that as well. So thank you for that.
Thank you.
Okay, that is the end of the main interview, but here is just a little bit more.
People are much less likely to murder each other in 1690 than they had been in 1610. There's less violent burglary, that kind of thing, and it's partly because society is wealthier and there's not as much of a poverty problem. But people had lived through the Civil War, and the idea of violence was just something that horrified them because
How many real opportunities were there to prevent the Civil War and the uprising against Charles I, or was it was everyone set on a collision course that couldn't be changed?
He has a pretty good opportunity actually in 1647 to come to a fairly good settlement, but he decides that he doesn't want it because he thinks he's got a chance to win back everything.
If you want to listen for longer to Jonathan's interview, and it is well worth it, I can promise you, you can go along to patreon.com/British history. There you will find this interview and many other historian interviews. You can watch extended versions and they are all ad-free, so none of those annoying breaks. You also will get the opportunity to put your questions to our guests in the future. For instance, coming up next will be Gareth Russell. So if you're a member of my Patreon, you would get a chance to ask your questions to Gareth. So go along to patreon.com/British history for a low monthly cost. You can get all of that. I'd love to see you there.